back, continuing this amazing book. All right, so we read the prologue last time. Now we're on chapter 1, and we're probably going to go up to chapter 5 or 6. I think I'm going to start putting it in the title so that it's easier to follow. Yeah, not that many people follow, but you never know. So if you guys want to follow along, yeah, just from the other book, just if you go back, I did it in order, so yeah, but now I'll put it in the title, like chapter 1 to chapter 5, chapter 5 to chapter 10, whatever. Okay. All right, the door. 3. This is the number of your fate. 3. Yes, 3 is mystic. 3 stands at the heart of the mantra. Which 3? The first is dark-haired. He stands on the brink of robbery and murder. A demon has infested him. The name of the demon is heroin. Which demon is that? I know it not, even from nursery stories. He tried to speak, but his voice was gone. The voice of the oracle, star slut, whore of the winds, both were gone. He saw a card fluttering down from nowhere to nowhere, turning and turning in the lazy dark. On it, a baboon grinned from over the shoulder of a young man with dark hair. Its disturbingly human fingers were buried so deeply in the young man's neck that their tips had disappeared in flesh. Looking more closely, Gunslinger saw the baboon held a whip in one of those clutching, strangling hands. The face of the red man seemed to writhe in wordless terror. The prisoner, the man in black, who had once been a man the gunslinger trusted, a man named Walter, whispered chummily, a trifle upsetting, isn't he? A trifle upsetting, trifle upsetting, a trifle. The gunslinger snapped awake, waving at something with his mutilated hand, sure that in a moment one of the monstrous shelled things from the western sea would drop on him, desperately inquiring in its foreign tongue as it pulled its face off his skull. Instead, a seabird attracted by the glister of the morning sun on the buttons of his shirt, wheeled away with a frightened squawk. Roland sat up. His hand throbbed wretchedly, endlessly. His right foot did the same. Both fingers and toe continued to insist they were there. The bottom half of his shirt was gone. What was left resembled a ragged vest. He had used one piece to bind his hand, the other to bind his foot. Go away, he told the absent part of his body. You are a ghost now. Go away. It helped a little. Not much, but a little. They were ghosts, all right, but lively ghosts. The gunslinger ate jerky. His mouth wanted it little, his stomach less, but he insisted. When it was inside him, he felt a little stronger. There was not much left, though. He was nearly up against it. Yet things needed to be done. He rose unsteadily to his feet and looked about. Birds swooped and dived, but the world seemed to belong to only him and them. Monstrosities were gone. Perhaps they were nocturnal, perhaps tidal. At the moment, it seemed to make no difference. The sea was enormous, meeting the horizon at a misty blue point that was impossible to determine. For a long moment, the gunslinger forgot his agony in its contemplation. He had never seen such a body of water. Had heard of it in children's stories, of course. Had even been assured by his teachers, some at least, that it existed. But to actually see it in its immensity, this amazement of water after years of arid land, was difficult to accept, difficult to even see. He looked at it for a long time, enwrapped, making himself see it, temporarily forgetting his pain and wonder. But it was morning. There were still things to be done. He felt for the jawbone in his back pocket, careful to lead with the palm of his hand, not wanting the stubs of his fingers to encounter it if it was still there. Changing that hand's ceaseless sobbing to screams. It was all right. Next, he clumsily unbuckled his gun belts, laid them on a sunny rock. He removed the guns, swung the chambers out, removed the useless shells, threw them away. A bird settled on the right gleam, tossed back by one of them, picked it up in its beak, and then dropped it and flew away. The guns themselves must be tended to. Should have been tended to before this, but since no gun in this world or any other was more than a club without ammunition, he laid the gun belts themselves over his lap before doing anything else and carefully ran his left hand over the leather. Each of them was damp from buckle and clasp to the point where the belts would cross his hips. From that point, they seemed dirty. He carefully removed each shell from the dry portions of the belt. His right hand kept trying to do this job, insisted on forgetting its reduction in spite of the pain, and he found himself returning it to his knee again and again, like a dog too stupid or fractious to heal. In his distracted pain, he came close to swatting it once or twice. I see serious problems ahead, he thought again. He put these shells, hopefully still good, in a pile that was dishearteningly small. 20 of those. A few would almost certainly miss fire. He could depend on none of them. He removed the rest and put them in another pile. 37. Well, you weren't heavy loaded anyway, he thought, but he recognized the difference between 57 live rounds and what might be 20 or 10 or 5 or 1 or none. He put the dubious shells in the second pile. He still had his purse. That was one thing. He put it in his lap and then slowly disassembled his guns and performed the ritual of cleaning. By the time he had finished, 2 hours had passed and his pain was so intense his head reeled with it. Conscious thought had become difficult. He wanted to sleep. He had never wanted that more in his life. But in the service of duty, there was never any acceptable reason for denial. Court, he said in a voice that he couldn't recognize, and laughed dryly. Slowly, he reassembled his revolvers, loaded them with the shells he presumed to be dry. When the job was done, he held the one made for his left hand, cocked it, and then slowly lowered the hammer again. He wanted to know, yes, wanted to know if there would be a satisfying report when he squeezed the trigger, or only another of those useless clicks. But a click would mean nothing, and a report would only reduce 20 to 19, or 9, or 3, or none. He tore away another piece of his shirt, put the other shells, the ones which had been wetted, in it, and tied it using his left hand and his teeth. He put them in his purse. Sleep, his body demanded. Sleep, you must sleep now before dark. There's nothing left, you're used up. He tottered to his feet, looked up and down the deserted strand. It was the color of an undergarment which had gone a long time without washing, littered with seashells which had no color. Here and there, large rocks protruded from the gross-grained sand, and these were covered with guano and older layers of yellow and ancient teeth, the fresher splotches white. The high tide line was marked with dying kelp. You could see pieces of his right boot and his water skins lying near the line. He thought it almost a miracle that the skins hadn't been washed out to sea by high surging waves. Walking slowly, limping exquisitely, the gunslinger made his way to where they were. He picked up one of them, shook it by his ear. The other was empty. This one still had a little water left in it. Most would not have been able to tell the difference between the two, but the gunslinger knew each just as well as a mother knows which of her identical twins is which. He had been traveling with these water skins for a long, long time. Water sloshed inside. That was good. A gift. Either the creature which had attacked him or any of the others could have torn this or the other open with one casual bite or a slice of claw, but none had, and the tide had spared it. Of the creature itself there was no sign, although the two of them had finished far above the tide line. Perhaps other predators had taken it, perhaps its own kind had given it a burial at sea. As the elephants, giant creatures of whom he had heard in childhood stories, were reputed to bury their own dead. He lifted the water skin with his left elbow, drank deeply, and felt some strength come back into him. The right boot was of course ruined, but then he felt a spark of hope. The foot itself was intact, scarred but intact, and it might be possible to cut the other down to match it, and make something which would last at least a while. Faintness stole over him. He fought it, but his knees unhinged, and he sat down stupidly, biting his tongue. You won't fall unconscious, he told himself grimly. Not here, not where another one of those things can come back tonight and finish the job. So he got to his feet, tied the empty skin about his waist, but he had only gone 20 yards back to the place where he had left his guns and purse when he fell down again, fainting, half fainting. He lay there a while, one cheek pressed against the sand, the edge of the seashell biting against the edge of his jaw, almost deep enough to draw blood. He managed to drink from the water skin, and then he crawled back to the place where he had awakened. There was a Joshua tree, 20 yards up the slope. It was stunted, but it would offer at least some shade. To Roland, the 20 yards looked like 20 miles. Nonetheless, he laboriously pushed what remained of his possessions into that little puddle of shade. He lay there with his head in the grass, already fading towards what could be sleep or unconsciousness or death. He looked into the sky and tried to judge the time. Not noon, but the size of the puddle of shade in which he rested said noon was close. He held on a moment longer, turning his right arm over and bringing it close to his eyes, looking for the telltale red lines of infection, of some poison seeping steadily towards the middle of him. The palm of his hand was dull red, not a good sign. I jerk off left-handed, he thought. At least that's something. Then darkness took him, and he felt for the next 16 hours, and he slept for the next 16 hours, with the sound of western sea pounding ceaselessly in his dreaming ears. When the gunslinger awoke again, the sea was dark, but there was a faint light in the sky to the east. Morning was on its way. He sat up. Waves of dizziness almost overcame him. He bent his head and waited. When the faintness had passed, he looked at his hand. It was infected all right. Telltale red swelling that spread up the palm to the wrist. It stopped there, but already he could see the faint beginnings of other red lines, which will lead eventually to his heart and kill him. He felt hot, feverish. I need medicine, he thought, but there is no medicine here. Had he come this far just to die then? He would not. And if he were to die in spite of his determination, he would die on his way to the tower. How remarkable you are, Gunslinger, the man in black tittered inside his head. How indomitable, how romantic in your stupid obsession. Fuck you, he croaked, and drank. Not much water left either. There was a whole sea in front of him for all the good it could do him. Water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. Never mind. He buckled on his gun belts, tied them. This was a process which took so long that before he was done, the first faint light of dawn had brightened to the day's actual prologue. And then tried to stand up. He was not convinced he could do it until it was done. Holding to the Joshua tree with his left hand, he scooped up the not quite empty water skin with his right arm and slung it over his shoulder, then his purse. When he strained, the faintness washed over him again, and he put his head down, waiting, willing. The faintness passed. Walking with the weaving, wavering steps of a man in the last stages of an ambulatory drunkenness, the gunslinger made his way back down to the strand. He stood looking at the ocean, dark as mulberry wine, and then took the last of his jerky from his purse. He ate half, and this time both mouth and stomach accepted a little more willingly. He turned and ate the other half, and he watched the sun come up over the mountains, where Jake had died, first seeming to catch on the cruel, treeless teeth of those peaks, and then rising above them. Roland held his face to the sun, closed his eyes, and smiled. He ate the rest of his jerky. He thought, very well, I am now a man with no food, with 2 less fingers, 1 less toe than I was born with. I am a gunslinger with shells which may not fire. I am sickening from a monster's bite. I have no medicine. I have a day's water if I'm lucky. I may be able to walk perhaps a dozen miles if I press myself to the last extremity. I am, in short, a man on the edge of everything. Which way would he walk? He had come from the east. He could not walk west without the powers of a saint or a savior. That left north and south. North. That was the answer, his heart told. There was no question in it. North. Gunslinger began to walk. He walked for 3 hours. He fell twice, and the second time he did not believe he would be able to get up again. Then a wave came towards him, close enough to make him remember his guns. And he was up before he knew it, standing on logs that quivered like stilts. He thought he had managed about 4 miles in those 3 hours. Now the sun was growing hot, but not hot enough to explain the way his head pounded or the sweat pouring down his face, nor was the breeze from the sea strong enough to explain the sudden fits of shuddering which sometimes gripped him, making his body lump into goose flesh and his teeth chatter. Fever, Gunslinger, the man in black tittered. What's left inside you has been touched to fire. The red lines of infection were more pronounced now, and they had marched upwards from his right wrist, halfway to his elbow. He made another mile, drained his water bag dry. He tied it around his waist with the other. The landscape was monotonous and unpleasing. The sea to his right, the mountains to his left, the gray, shell-littered sand under the feet of his cut-down boots. The waves came and went. He looked for the lobstrosities and saw none. He walked out of nowhere towards nowhere, a man from another time who it seemed had reached a point of pointless ending. Shortly before noon, he fell again, and he knew he could not get up. This was the place then. Here. This was the end, after all. On his hands and knees, he raised his head like a groggy fighter, and some distance ahead, perhaps a mile, perhaps 3, was difficult to judge, just as soon as along unchanging reach of strand, with the fever working inside of him, making his eyeballs pulse in and out. He saw something new, something which stood upright on the beach. What was it? 3? Didn't matter. 3 and the number of your fate. Gunslinger managed to get to his feet again. Gunslinger managed to get to his feet again. He croaked something, some plea which only circled seabirds heard. And how happy they would be to gobble my eyes from my head, he thought. How happy to have such a tasty bit. And walked on, weaving more seriously now, leaving tracks behind him that were weird loops and swoops. He kept his eyes on whatever it was that stood on the strand ahead. When his hair fell in his eyes, he brushed it aside. It seemed to grow no closer. The sun reached the roof of the sky, where it seemed to remain far too long. Roland imagined he was in the desert again, somewhere between the last outlander's hut. The musical fruit, the more you eat, the more you toot. And the way station where the boy, your Isaac, had waited this coming. His knees buckled, straightened again. When his hair fell in his eyes once more, he did not bother to push it back, did not have the strength to push it back. He looked at the object, which now cast a narrow shadow back toward the upland, and kept walking. He could make it out now, fever or no fever. It was a door. Less than a quarter of a mile from it, Roland's knees buckled again, and this time he could not stiffen their hinges. He fell, his right hand dragged across gritty sand and shells. Stumps of his fingers screamed as fresh scabs were scored away. The stumps began to bleed again. So he crawled with steady rush, roar, and retreat of the western sea in his ears. He used his elbows and knees, digging grooves in the sand above the twist of dirty green kelp, which marked the high tide line. He supposed the wind was still blowing. It must be, for the chills continued to whip through his body. But the only wind he could hear was the harsh gale which gusted in and out of his lone lungs. The door grew closer. At last, around 3 o'clock of that long, delirious day, with his shadow beginning to grow long on his left, he reached it. He sat back on his haunches and regarded it warily. It stood 6.5 feet high, appeared to be made of solid ironwood, although the nearest ironwood tree must grow 700 miles or more from here. The doorknob looked as if it were made of gold, and it was filigreed with a design which the gunslinger finally recognized. It was the grinning face of a baboon. There was no keyhole in the knob above it or below it. The door had hinges, but they were fastened to nothing, or so it seems, the gunslinger thought. This is a mystery, a most marvelous mystery, but does it really matter? You are dying. Your own mystery, the only one that really matters to any man or woman in the end, approaches. All the same, it did seem to matter. This door where no door should be, it simply stood there on the gray strand 20 feet above the high tide line. Seemingly as eternal as the sea itself, now casting the slanted shadow of its thickness towards the east as the sun westerned. Written upon it in black letters 2/3 of the way up, written in high speech, were the words, "The prisoner." A demon had infested him. The name of the demon is Heroin. The gunslinger could hear a low droning noise. At first he thought it must be the wind or a sound in his own feverish head, but he became more and more convinced that the sound was the sound of motors that was coming from behind the doors. Open it then. It's not locked. You know it's not locked. Instead, he tottered gracelessly to his feet, walked above the door, and walked around to the other side. There was no other side. Only dark gray strand stretching back and back. Only the waves, the shells, the high tide line, the marks of his own approach. Boot prints and holes that had been made by his elbows. He looked again, and his eyes widened a little. The door wasn't here, but its shadow was. He started to put out his right hand. Oh, it was so slow, learning its new place in what was left of his life. Dropped it and raised his left hand instead. He groped, feeling for hard resistance. If I feel it, I'll knock on nothing, the gunslinger thought. That would be an interesting thing to do before dying. His hand encountered thin air far past the place where the door, even if invisible, should have been. Nothing to knock on. And the sound of motors, if that's what it really was, was gone. Now there was just the wind, the waves, and the sick buzzing inside his head. The gunslinger walked slowly back to the other side, of what wasn't there, already thinking it had been a hallucination to start with. He stopped. At one moment, he had been looking west at an uninterrupted view of gray rolling waves. Then his view was interrupted by the thickness of the door. He could see its key plate, which also looked like gold, with the latch protruding from like a stubby metal tongue. Roland moved his head an inch to the north, and the door was gone. Moved it back to where it had been, and it was there again. It did not appear, it was just there. He walked all the way around and faced the door, swaying. He could walk around on the seaside, but he was convinced that the same thing would happen, only this time he would fall down. I wonder if I could go through it from the other side. Oh, there were all sorts of things to wonder about, but the truth was simple. Here stood this door, alone, on an endless stretch of beach, and it was for only one of two things, opening or leaving closed. Gunslinger realized with dim humor that maybe he wasn't dying quite as fast as he thought. If he had been, would he feel this scared? He reached out and grasped the doorknob with his left hand. Neither the deadly cold of the metal or the thin, fiery heat of the runes engraved upon it surprised him. He turned the knob, the door opened towards him when he pulled. Of all the things he might have expected, this was not any of them. The gunslinger looked, froze, uttered the first scream of terror in his adult life, and slammed the door. There was nothing for it to bang shut on, but it banged shut just the same, sending seabirds screeching up from the rocks which had perched to watch him. Interesting. Well, if you guys liked it, please subscribe and like the video. It helps me motivate myself to keep posting videos. But yeah, hope you guys are doing well, and see you next time.